Everybody is just starting to get let in. We're going to give it a minute to populate, but I just want to say good morning to everyone and welcome to this week's Business Unusual, where we're going to have a great treat being joined by Congressman Lee Zeldin, who proudly represents us in the 1st Congressional District, which I have to tell you, I love the fact that Suffolk County is the 1st Congressional District. Boy, that just must burn every other congressman's ass out there, but I'm good with that, right? I, along with my co-host, Peter Klein, we started this webcast right when COVID quarantine started, and we call it Business Unusual because nothing is usual in today's economy. And what we've been able to do every week is bring in folks from hard-hit sectors to talk about what they're seeing, what they're doing, how they're planning their recovery. And we do it so we can all learn together. So we're all getting real-time information about what's going on in the different industries. We are all in this together. Our economy is requiring all of us to get through this together. And so that's our hope and our goal. Next week, just to give everybody a heads up, next week I think we're going to be looking at the performing arts. Is that right, Lauren? Yep. So we're going to have the folks from the Stoller Center and the Tiller Center. As you know, the performing arts have been clobbered by COVID. And then after that, I think we're going to have Dr. Ken Kashansky from Stony Brook University Medical Center to talk about where we're going with the vaccine and all the medical stuff. And like I said, we have Congressman Lee Zeldin here. Lee, feel free to weigh in on anything, but I have to pick on Peter every week at the start with the market, right? And so, Peter, we talked about this. I looked at the Wall Street Journal this morning. The top 3 headlines are 3 major banks, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, and JP Morgan, are estimating tens of billions of dollars of losses due to coronavirus, COVID-19. And I'm looking over at my TV and I see green where I see the Dow, and it's up. It's up a couple hundred points, right? So what's the deal, dude? What's your take this week, right?
What's happening out there?
Right.
Thanks, Joe, and hello, Lee. Looking forward to chatting with you. Yeah, it's an interesting, very bizarre time for the market participants. You would think that given the news feed that's out there, the losses and the earnings are just starting now. That was the first earnings release was today, so we're going to have a lot of earnings to digest or get indigestion from over the course of the next couple of weeks. But it is the markets will always go to extremes, Joe, right? They will always go to too frothy or too washed out. And I think we're in the former camp right now in the sense that things are getting a little bit overdone in certain sectors. As you know, out of the S&P 500, there are 5 stocks, and you know the ones those are, that control 22% of the capitalization of the S&P. Now, for those listeners and viewers who don't understand, the S&P 500, the most popular quoted index, maybe Dow Jones as well, but the S&P 500, 500 stocks, but they're not equally weighted, right? They are capitalization weighted. So the largest cap companies, those 5 you mentioned, control more than a fifth. 5 stocks out of 500 control more than a fifth of the overall market. That's a very concentrated market, and that's not typically a good sign. In fact, if you look at the differential between the equally weighted S&P, again, the same stocks equally weighted, one 500th each, versus the S&P, the difference is stark. The S&P is down 2 or 3% for the year. The equally weighted S&P is down 12, 13% for the year. Big difference, same companies. So we have to fully understand that, and we have to understand the issues of debt in our system, and we have to talk a little bit about how we're going to, get ourselves out of this going forward.
Yeah, and that's a great analysis, Peter, and Lee. That's sort of what we want to talk about today, right? So, lot to cover. I'll tell you, we got a lot of questions beforehand from people wanting to talk about stimulus package, wanted to talk about relief, and we'll get there. But I think the first thing I want to find out is how is Lee doing, right? So I think a lot of times people forget that elected officials are human. They have families, they have wives, they have kids, they have parents. There's some background noise on one of you guys. I'm not sure who's talking. Might want to mute.
Definitely not on my end.
Yeah, I think that's Jane I hear, Peter. I'm not sure. Yeah.
I'm gonna close the door. I'm gonna close the door.
Yep. So Lee, how are you? How's it going in the 120 days of COVID? How has the Zeldin family been managing? Because we worry about you.
Well, thanks, Joe. It's great to be with you and Peter. Family is holding up really well, and my girls are in a summer day camp right now, a condensed schedule, but be able to go out and play sports, to be with other kids. It's been a few months, and there are many different dynamics to the health of our children and the upbringing and the learning and the need for social interaction. So while certainly one of the silver linings of the shutdown was being able to spend more time with my wife and daughters than I would have been able to spend normally, on the flip side of that, you have these twin girls who are finishing middle school. It abruptly gets cut short around the middle of March, and they're looking forward to being able to interact with their friends again, hopefully at the start of the academic year this September. So we'll see how that works out. They may be starting a high school hopefully on time, and we're awaiting that decision from the state, but everyone's holding up well. Everyone's healthy. And I hope the same goes for both of you, your families, everyone that you work with, for the dozens of people who are here on the line at the moment. I really appreciate everybody taking the time with everything going on for today's discussion. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great, and I'm glad to hear that. I think everything in my world is as good as can be expected, right? People are healthy, and I'll tell you, Lee, that you and I spoke in an HIA forum. I spoke with the county executive in an HIA forum, and one of the things that I think New York is going to come out of this, particularly with seeing how well our numbers are, has been that there has been incredible bipartisan and interrelated governmental cooperation here for the state of New York. And I go all the way back, and the county executive has said it, and even if the governor hasn't said it, he knows it. I know it's an election year and it's tough, but really what we've seen, especially here on Long Island, has been an incredible effort. And Steve Balloon gave you a shout out, and I know you gave him a shout out, going all the way back to PPE and everything that's had to be done. So talk about that sort of mobilization force right from the very beginning, because I can remember it was probably day 2 that we were on lockdown when you reached out and said, how can I help? How can I help HIA? How can I help get PPE? Can we use some of the companies? Talk about the last 90 days for you and what that agenda has been like.
For us, approaching this in the middle of March, we looked at it as Long Islanders. We didn't look at it as Republicans and Democrats. There wasn't a conservative, moderate, and liberal approach to the lockdown when we were launching. It was all about us working together, sticking together, identifying what our needs were at different levels of government. What do hospitals need? What do individuals need to get through it? As you're trying to craft those initial few bills to make sure that you are delivering the support that our local small businesses would need to be able to survive a shutdown. At first, it was getting a disaster declaration for all of, not just Suffolk County, but essentially all of the state. And we could discuss that loan. And then there was the PPP program, which hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss how that played out. Now we just saw the Main Street lending facility get stood up about just over a week ago. And it's all a product of good dialogue, good communication, good partnership, good teamwork. So when the county executive reached out to me one late week, it was getting towards a Saturday evening conversation, ended up having with one of his team members a couple days later, and we identified that the county stockpile was out of key PPE. So late at night on a Saturday, I'm in touch with the White House. I remember going back and forth between Lisa Black, who works for County Executive Steve Ballone, and Jared Kushner, who we all know works for the president. And Jared had questions that he needed answers from the county. And here we are at the 10, 11 o'clock hour on a Saturday night, trying to find out what the burn rate is, how much is needed for the next 30 days, where are orders currently placed, when are they expected to arrive. And then fast forward the less than 24 hours later, you already started to see deliveries of the three-ply surgical masks. But that evening, 5 o'clock, the president's doing his press briefing, and he's announcing that at my request, he was sending hundreds of thousands of N95 masks here. And you saw the entire process work. You saw a good, healthy flow of communication between the county executive and myself. For me to be able to pick up the phone, to call the White House, to be able to have that information flow from, the most local of levels all the way up to the most highest of levels, and with principals weighing in to cut through any red tape to make sure the stuff got done right away. That was one example. I mean, there's countless other examples of where we were able to produce results as a product of approaching this as Long Islanders. And I'll tell you I'll say really briefly that one of the things that was unfortunate, all of a sudden people started talking about hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir, and somehow there was a political party that was placed on treatment. I don't know when this happened. I totally missed the memo, but apparently hydroxychloroquine got registered involuntarily to the Republican Party. Remdesivir got registered involuntarily to the Democratic Party. And I'm here saying I don't care what type of stupid party affiliation you're trying to put on a treatment. Let's get this stuff studied, get it through the FDA as quickly as possible. Let's get people help. It's about ramping up testing, ramping up treatments, getting a vaccine out the door. It just requires pushback whenever someone needs a reminder that we're all in this together.
Yeah, Lee, it's so I'm a constitutional historian. I've given my whole life to studying the Constitution and watching it play out. It's been a very interesting 4 years. But what you just described, right? What you just described is exactly the way the system is supposed to work. A member of the House, there's 435 of you, a member of the House is supposed to be our liaison to the White House, to the federal resource system. We're supposed to be able to funnel through you. You're supposed to be able to jump into action and get us resources. And it's exactly what happened. And yet nobody wants to focus on the positive, right? Nobody wants to focus on the stuff that works. They want to focus on the stuff that doesn't work. And it absolutely pisses me off till no end that that's where the focus is.
Joe, moreover, let's not forget how great it was that the local on-the-ground grassroots forces were able to get to Lee so that Lee could then get to the White House. So it's really a perfect sort of what you want to call it, movement, if you will. And very quick too, by the way. It seemed like it worked out very fast.
Yeah, if I could give one more example too, was the county executive, Suffolk County, wanted access to the municipal liquidity facility. They created the municipal liquidity facility, but capped the population at 2 million people, which for a county of ours, which is around 1.5, maybe just under, I guess we'll see what the next census looks like. We were able, I set up a call, reached out to Secretary Mnuchin, and he called me back, and I was putting the pitch in, but part of it, I said, it'd be very helpful if you wouldn't mind, can I get the county executive on the line? Let's have a quick huddle here. Let's discuss it. And being able to, again, just to this last point about PPE, same thing plays out in a municipal liquidity facility where you get the Secretary of Treasury on the phone with the Suffolk County executive, for the Suffolk County executive to be able to make his pitch as to why the county needs access. And it was within just a few days after that, the liquidity facility got expanded and Suffolk County became eligible.
Yeah, it's great. It's great stuff. I think that we lose, and unfortunately the American public, because of the media, loses how important congressional representatives are to the fabric of of the United States, right? It becomes incredibly important. I mean, 435 districts, trying to get about 710,000 people in each district. And I got to tell you, Lee, you have a tough district, right? So here we have, if you look at your section, you go from the super wealthy East Hamptoners to the clam diggers to the, bread and butter, middle class, Brookhaven, working class teachers. So how do you manage all that? It's got to be incredibly difficult to manage all of those competing interests, particularly from a policy perspective.
From one issue to the next, the view of my constituency changes. On one issue, it could be an 80-20 issue, where 80% of the people out there agree with my position on a particular issue. There could be another issue where, maybe most agree with my position. Maybe there's something else, some other issue being debated. I don't poll every single issue that's out there. Maybe there's something, where 40% of the district is supportive on that particular issue, but you can't try to be all things to all people. And I think that's where people in my position get themselves into a lot of trouble. They end up giving different answers to different crowds to try to pander and appease everybody. Essentially, you're going to get caught in that lie where you're not consistent. And the other thing, too, I would say of my colleagues and others who are in elected office, everybody knows there's no disagreement as to what the best answer is you can give someone who comes to you with an ask. It's an honest yes. They're asking you for something. For you to be able to say yes and be genuine and true and pure in actually agreeing that to be able to help them out with regards to what they're asking for. But here's where it diverges from there. Half the people in elected office believe that the second best answer is a dishonest yes, where you're telling someone what they want to hear, but you're BSing them. The other half of the people who are in elected office believe that the second best answer is an honest no. I fall in that second crowd. And it doesn't always work out when I'm in meetings with people sometimes, because I'll just cut to the chase. I respect your time. You're in my office. You might have multiple asks. Maybe there's something else you want to talk about I can help you with. But I think most of the time people appreciate you just letting them know where you stand on an issue. There are so many times where I've weighed in on an issue where I could have just sat that one out and not told anybody where I stood, because politically maybe it's smart to try to be all things to all people. It's just not my style. So to answer you, it's a great question, Joe, and I think it applies really to anyone who's in elected office at any position, is to not try to be all things to all people. Shoot straight. If you're not with someone with what they're asking for, just let them know that up front. Don't string them along. And understand that from one issue to the next, the block of people who may agree with you may disagree. And the other thing too is don't spend 90% of your time focused on 10% of the people who will just never work with you. You can obsess over trying to engage with that 10% of the population. The issue is that 10% of the population, there are people who they're just trying to stir the pot. They're just trying to cause trouble. They're not looking to unite everyone in a community. They live off of that division, and they're concerned that if they get caught working with you too much, that politically you might help your opposition get elected. It's the wrong attitude.
Yeah, and Lee, I've been a supporter of yours for a long time, and you just summed up why, right? I know where you stand. We don't always agree on every issue. I know where you stand, and you work really, really hard for Long Island, and I respect and appreciate that incredibly much. Let's turn to PPP. Okay, so PPP became this huge acronym the last 90 days in the United States. Lot of questions still exist in terms of how Treasury and the SBA are going to allow forgiveness. A lot of questions apply in terms of tax treatments. Where are you guys in that whole process? Is Congress involved in that at all? Is that a thumb wrestle between SBA and Treasury? When are we going to get clarity? Because it's causing a lot of heartburn in the business community right now.
I serve on the House Financial Services Committee, so we've been intimately involved in so many different financial policy aspects, the crafting of legislation, working with Treasury, working with the Federal Reserve, the SEC, the GSEs, the banks, both large and small, including community banks, the credit unions. So from the aspect of crafting a bill that might get passed through Congress and signed by the president, to the crafting and tweaking, improving of regulations and guidance, all the way to the other extreme, outside of those formalities and just one-on-one, the oversight role, working with GSE banks, the large ones and the smaller credit unions. We've been heavily involved. What my feedback was I received from the first tranche of money of PPP were primarily stories from individuals who didn't get a loan. It was about a particular bank or two or three. There were certain banks that just completely fell on their face. Some banks fell on their face because they just never quite figured it out, but they were trying really hard to, but something just wasn't working. And then there were other banks that totally knew what they were doing, but they were just prioritizing the bigger loans over the smaller loans because they're able to make more money with less effort. It was a matter of efficiency, and primarily it was some of the bigger banks who were the biggest, the banks that were committing those infractions the most. It was the smaller banks that actually did the best job we saw across the board with that first tranche of money. The second tranche of money, the feedback has been outstanding. I was talking to the mayor of Patchogue going back a few weeks ago, and we were talking about this very topic. And I asked him, how are the small businesses doing from your perspective? Are any going to shut down as a result of what we just went through? The mayor was saying that the entire downtown of the village of Patchogue, that all the businesses were going to make it through, and he wasn't aware of any of them that were shutting down. And it was that second tranche of PPP funding that up and down Main Street, they were all getting their loans approved, which was absolutely outstanding. There's still some money available in PPP. There's also a discussion, negotiation right now with regards to there being a fifth coronavirus-related bill getting passed as early as these next few weeks, possibly before the August recess starts. As of now, the House is scheduled to be in recess in the month of August. That could change. Our last day is here at the very end of July, but that could spill into August. That would be smart if we still have really important unfinished business, such as being really close maybe with this bill. So this isn't just about expanding the pot of money. It's also about expanding the loan. You mentioned the loan forgiveness. I believe that we should have more flexibility in the program. Some of the individuals, some of the businesses that received money should be able to possibly get some additional funding, in my opinion. We can't treat all geographic areas in the country the same. We also can't treat all industries the same. If you're a business that never shut down, that you're operating throughout this entire time, you can't treat that business the same way as you're going to treat, say, that gym in Suffolk County that still hasn't opened yet. So maybe there's additional PPP funding that needs to be provided to that gym. Now, earlier on, I mentioned the EIDL, Emergency Injury Disaster Loans. That program doesn't come with a generous loan forgiveness, but there is help there, as well as the Main Street Lending Facility, which, as I mentioned, came on board last week. I see that on this call, I have Connor Carney, who's in my DC office. He's my legislative director. He also is the staffer in my DC office to the House Financial Services Committee. I would encourage anyone who's out there who has any questions from a constituent standpoint on these topics to reach out to my office, 631-289-1097. Ask your questions, get informed, let me know what your feedback is. If there's something else that you need, I'd love to be able to know that, especially as we're negotiating this next bill.
Yeah, it's great. And Connor was very helpful with the HIA LI. I'll give him a shout out, the 501c6 issues as it related to the EIDL loans. Lee, let me ask you about enhanced unemployment. So as a business owner and as someone who represents business owners, there's mixed emotions about these enhanced unemployment benefits, right? In one hand, we're hoping for a V-shaped recovery and be adding jobs back. On the other hand, fortunately or unfortunately, enhanced unemployment can tend to incentivize people, especially in the lower paying industries, which we are seeing the most hard hit, the restaurants, hospitality types of industries, to not return. Maybe legitimately, maybe they're concerned for their health, maybe they don't have childcare issues, okay, straightened out. But with enhanced unemployment, it's a disincentive to return to a lower paying job. How is that being played out? Because I've been reading a lot about there being debate about extending it. How is that being played out?
Well, you just summed up maybe the most important point is that you can't paint this entire issue with one broad brush. But to get to the heart of the biggest issue with it is the individual who is capable of going back to their job. Their employer needs them to go back to their job, but that employee is actually getting paid more to stay at home and receive this enhanced unemployment than to go back to work. That's a huge problem. That's something that we can't continue. I mean, period. Like, there's just, you cannot allow that scenario to be playing out all across America for employers who, you know, have a business that is ready to rip again. You know, that everything's teed up for a nice, strong rebound. It's important for that business, for that community, for our economy, for our country to be able to be moving and working. The person who is totally able, there's no reason why they can't go back to work. And the only reason why they don't go back is because they're making more money to stay at home. That has to end.
Agreed.
Yeah, listen, one of the things I think we learned was PPP, that early PPP, in my opinion, was probably a couple of weeks premature because it conflicted with those enhanced unemployment benefits. And I think a lot of companies burned PPP dollars too soon. I think we've all learned that, and we've extended the timeout. I agree wholeheartedly with you that industries like restaurants and hospitality probably deserve a second round of PPP funding. I mean, it's really difficult right now with what they're going through, but we got to get people moving. We got to get people working again. There's not just an economic value to it. There's a social and mental value behind it. People are isolated. People are losing their minds. People got to get productive and get moving again. I mean, yeah, we can do things, but I was just talking to my partner. He's a member of a yacht club here on Long Island. They have a pool, and he was like, "Yeah, we could go there, but you had to make a reservation to go in the pool, and then you had a designated spot in the pool that was yours, and that's all you were able to swim." What the hell? What fun is that? There's no way to blow off any steam doing that, right? So we got to get it moving somehow and going forward. And that brings up my next point, and that is schools. So you have two beautiful daughters. They finished middle school. How do you feel about schools reopening in September? Where do you see that, and how do you feel about this sort of tussle between the states and the federal government in terms of owning that issue? Where do you come out on that?
Well, let me make believe for a moment I was the person making the call on this. This is what I would be saying to the over 700 school districts in New York State, is to prepare to be open at the beginning of the school year. Start preparing right now. Let us know what it is that you need as you assess each individual classroom. You speak to your teachers, your administrators. You look at your systems, the infrastructure of your school. Let us know here at the state what it is that you need in order to be ready. And I think that it would be a huge issue if we don't send that message right now, and instead you wait until the second week of August Now, Congress has passed the fifth coronavirus bill. August recess has started. By the way, when we come back, we're in the middle of an election season, not just for Congress, but also for the White House. So I think it's unlikely that there's going to be a sixth coronavirus bill at this point when you come back from August recess, if you do a fifth one before then. So right now is the time to be identifying anything that any of our schools desperately need in order to be ready. And teachers need to start to plan to be ready to hit the ground running on day one. The other thing too, by the way, is I think to a certain extent, for the better, education has forever changed. Here we are on Zoom, and you have an ability to have a study group with classmates, in an evening, on a weekend. You're studying for a midterms or a finals. It could be a meeting with your teacher. It could be a meeting with a student mentor. It could be a meeting with a tutor. We need to have the ability for our students all throughout the state. Every student should have the ability to get onto a technology like this from home, because you're once again, you will end up with another example of leaving people behind with the quality of education because they don't have access to the same type of resources that other classmates have who are better off. So that's a component of this too, which, by the way, regardless of whatever corner of America you're in, that is a dynamic of what needs to be happening right now for the fall and beyond. I think it's about telling our schools to be ready right now, for parents and children to start getting ready now, but to also embrace the good of this technology that they're utilizing, because I think that can be positively impacted, can positively impact the quality of education. The last piece is this: if for some reason between now and the start of the academic year, there is a massive second wave that just starts hitting us really hard, and you're showing me, all sorts of reliable, data and information to make your compelling argument as to why there needs to be a deviation from that guidance you put out on July 14th, let's have that conversation. But let's not go with the opposite end of this, where we're not planning to be open because we're saying it's all going to be dependent on that information at the end. So therefore, you don't have all of your, all these school districts and teachers and administrators, parents, children, all doing what they need to be ready. And if I could throw in one other alibi, is I think it's important for kids to be in school. You hear it from pediatricians. It's important for their learning. We were talking about it earlier about the need to interact socially for your growth. I mean, my daughters have gotten bigger during the lockdown. That's something that you see physically, but time is so precious, and the way it impacts you with your learning, with your physical growth, with your mental, emotional growth on so many different levels. We can't discount the health of having our kids in school. And right now everyone who's trying to prevent kids from going back to school are talking about the health is the reason why they can't go back. Let's be honest with this conversation. There are health impacts too if they don't go back.
I agree. And, I want to raise the health and safety aspect versus the economic aspect, because I think people tend to take one path or the other. And Peter, if you want to weigh in on this, I'd appreciate it. So the video conferencing market, when I was early 2000s, the company I was general counsel and president of was a video conferencing company. Could never seem to take off, right? It just never seemed to take off. And even as recently as 6 months ago, it never really seemed to take off. I think COVID has forced us to learn to embrace Zoom, for better or for worse. It's great. Even not-for-profit boards, I think, it totally changed. We realized there's no reason to have to drive an hour to go to a meeting. We can jump on a Zoom. It's great. But let's talk about the cataclysmic economic challenges that brings into our economy now, right? So Amazon, it starts in 1999, and 20 years later, we're seeing retail become really severely affected by it pre-COVID. Now we're looking at, schools. So school districts are not going to be operating at 100% 100% physical capacity, universities, not-for-profit boards. The ripple in the economy is overwhelming. It's overwhelming.
Dominoes.
So many vendors, school bus vendors, janitors, janitorial supplies, paper suppliers, all these people economically, gas stations, car, automotive, all of this stuff now becomes severely impacted by this shift. So how do we deal with that? How do we plan with that? How in Washington is that being processed right now? Because that is the ultimate outcome economically of a more virtual reality for humanity, right? That's where it is. And I know it's a very deep question, but it is a practicality that we have to deal with. And we're looking at trillions of dollars already been thrown at this. How do we deal with that, Lee?
And let's not forget, how do we deal with the trillions of dollars in debt? That's another question unto itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say this. So there are definitely very different perspectives to these questions. There are different approaches, different philosophies, different viewpoints. I remember when I was in the state Senate, I'd be in a debate with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the New York State Senate. They're saying that taxes have no effect on behavior, which I would propose the hypothetical to them. If taxes have no effect on behavior, then why don't you just raise taxes to 100%? Why don't you just take everybody's money? If people aren't leaving the state because of taxes, then why are you stopping at that proposal of the day? I remember a back and forth between Kevin Parker and Greg Ball, where Kevin Parker is saying it's patriotic to pay taxes, and Greg Ball saying if it's patriotic to pay taxes, we live in the most patriotic state in the entire union. There's these fundamentally different views on economics, on business, on certain numbers that you might see. It means different things to different people. I mean, you saw the analysis done by AOC assessing the recent crime wave and the looting and the stealing in New York City, and the other aspects of crime that we're seeing is because people are in need of bread or something like that. There is a huge spectrum there. I would say you saw common ground found in the CARES Act. You saw it with the Paycheck Protection Program when you're providing additional funding to the EIDL, or maybe Republicans and Democrats on the House Financial Services Committee working together with the Federal Reserve and Treasury to stand up the Main Street lending facility. It's just about finding any type of common ground at all philosophically to be able to get through this, where our economy somehow is surviving and can come out of this stronger than we were before. But there isn't really one answer that sums up Congress's philosophy towards what we're going through right now. I mean, you saw it play out with the most recent bill that the House Democrats passed. It was actually the largest spending bill in the history of Congress. The House called it the HEROES Act. Now, by the way, that bill, early on, we're talking about enhanced unemployment. That bill was continuing enhanced unemployment until into 2021. It had a mass prison release. It was providing stimulus checks to people who aren't legally in the country. But meanwhile, you have other people who are hardworking individuals who didn't qualify for a check because they're making just a little bit too much, but they're struggling too. So you see the varying views play out with some of these individual bills. But at the end of the day, you just need to break through it. You need to reach agreement. Right now, we need to reach an agreement that I believe it would be good to provide liability protections for some of these businesses and other entities concerned about being sued for that business to reopen. You want to get back to our quality of life, for a way of life. You want these businesses to be successful. You don't want them to be worried all day, every day are just additional lawsuits because they have their front door open. There is some need for additional funding for state and local governments. Let's get common ground and figure out how to get that done. Now, I don't believe that we should be bailing out an entity for pre-COVID related budget problems that you had. We don't have that kind of money. To Peter's point, $3 trillion, we're talking trillions of dollars. That's a lot of money. For some of my colleagues, by the way, it's pretty crazy. A million is a billion, is a trillion. It's just a letter at the start of it. That's the only difference in these numbers. They'll propose something and they'll say, if we do it, it's going to, all we need to do is increase taxes on the wealthy just a little bit to make them pay their fair share, and then it would all be paid for. If you, I actually posted this on Twitter this morning, if you implemented everything that Democrats, my colleagues, want to do in Congress, if you try to implement all of it, this isn't about just increasing taxes a little bit on the wealthy. You can literally confiscate all of the wealth of the wealthiest Americans. Just take it, everything that they have, and you still don't have enough to pay for everything that they are pushing. So there's that end of it. And to Peter's point, to answer his question, long term is we need to actually have the American public, not just parts of the American public, much more of the American public, maybe most of the American public, demanding fiscally sound budgeting and the appropriations, that there should be a process, the regular order, that you are passing appropriations bills by the end of the year. You're not doing these dysfunctional CRs, that you're not just continuing to wait to the 11th hour, the last day, and you're raising the debt limit, but there was no discussion about making anything operate any more efficient in the many months or the year and a half since. And that's a conversation that can relate to Social Security and Medicare, where we need to approach it with the principle that for every senior, anyone close to retirement, that we are absolutely 100% going to preserve and protect Social Security and Medicare. Our seniors and those who are close to retirement need to know that it is absolutely 100% protected. At the same time, while doing that, we need to have a conversation of developing a 50-year plan. Let's start planning now for the year 2070. How about we do that today, having that
conversation,
as opposed to waiting until 2069? I mean,
Sure,
that's the long end of.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that, and thank you for your service and your service in the military as well. It's refreshing to see. And I've been very vocal on the issues that I'm worried about with respect to debt. I'll leave you with three numbers. It's 26 trillion on the federal side. There's 79 trillion when you add up all the local and municipal and consumer and corporate debt. And then if you add in that sort of unfunded pension liabilities, Social Security rather, you get up to 147 trillion. And you're right, that trillion gets lost in the weeds a little bit. That's a lot of capital. It's a lot of debt. And I worry day in and day out that that's going to be a problem going forward. We need to get behind that, and I applaud you and your efforts in that regard.
Yeah, that's a one with, 12 zeros after that?
The debt service alone is 18% of our GDP. So
right.
You think about how that crowds out investment. That's a worrisome situation.
Yeah, let me very briefly, I'll tell you, imagine it being, and we saw this play out in 2016 during a presidential debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. This can play out again in 2020, it can play out in 2024, 2028. A question is posed to people who are running for president of the United States: what are you going to do about this? And if the way to win the election is to punt, they're going to punt. And the only way that you're going to get them to take the tough stance and to win the election, by seeing the angle to win the election by taking that tough stance on debt, for example, or growing deficits, is when the American public demands it. But right now, the American public isn't demanding it. As a matter of fact, they're really, on balance, demanding a punt, whether or not people are willing to word it that way, or come to terms with it. And I'll tell you, it is devastating when the next president of the United States is about to come in and they commit that in their 4-year term, or the 8 years that are ahead of them, whatever the pledges that might be coming, let's say that 2024 debate, it's devastating when they commit to not do anything about these issues. You're basically done for like 4 years. So this is going to have to be a tail wagging the dog in demanding it of whether you're running for Congress or whether you're running for president of the United States. And right now, the American public isn't demanding it.
And in prior cycles, Joe, as you know, the bond vigilantes came into play. These are the guys that said, hey, wait a minute, we demand a higher interest rate on the Treasury debt. And that forced, sort of higher rates, which then, of course, really, confused the situation. So you're right. It's got to be, we need a Manhattan-like project to fix the debt. And I think that's, first get through COVID, but that's the next thing we got to work on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a commitment from the Fed to keep interest rates at near zero for the next 2 years almost. So it's very challenging. Lee, one of the questions I want to ask is, because I think you find yourself sometimes in a tough spot insofar as your district is here in New York. There's a push-pull going on between the governor and the president as to aid that New York needs, federal aid that New York needs. And I think it's fair to say that state and local governments are going to need some help. Just because of the amount of healthcare resources and other resources they weren't anticipating. Where does that play out in your debate, and where is that playing out in Congress in terms of aid to the state and local governments?
And going back to the HEROES Act bill, and I pointed out a couple of flaws with it, I'll give you another one. You had local governments asking for $250 billion. And then the HEROES Act puts in $375 billion. Well, what are you doing? I mean, you have an ambitious act, an ambitious ask of a national association saying that all of our local governments need $250 billion. They're asking for as much as they can possibly ask for on the highest end of an ask. You're going to give them $125 billion more than the highest end of their ask? Like, where's this money coming from? So I'm all for providing support, but we got to approach this with a straight face. And you saw that Governor Cuomo asked for something like $60-something billion, and the governor is just asking for. And it was for it was basically like a 3-year bailout of not just every COVID-19 related impact to the state's budget, but every other impact totally unrelated to COVID. And it's like, okay, don't just help us for this year. I need money right this second to bail us out for 3 years from now. I mean, and then we're going to go to Congress and then start passing out more money than these folks are even asking for. So let's have a conversation with a straight face and honest talk. Let's talk about COVID-related impacts only. Let's talk about survival, not fortune. I believe that there should be a little bit more flexibility than what we saw in the CARES Act. Suffolk County government, for example, received $257 million from the CARES Act. That's a lot of money. That was specifically just for COVID-19 related expenses. Now I'm for expanding that to allow that money to also be spent on COVID-19 related revenue losses. Why? I don't expect Suffolk County to be sending back unused money to Washington, D.C. And I'm just using Suffolk County as an example. I don't anticipate any recipient, any local government recipient of the CARES Act funding to be sending the money back to the Treasury saying, actually, we didn't need it. I would bet that you will find a toilet bowl somewhere in that local jurisdiction that is in need of the most expensive, most modern toilet bowl flusher ever invented before they return that money to the Treasury. So let's make sure that the money is spent as efficiently as possible. Additionally, we should drive support to some of our more local municipalities. There was a 500,000 population threshold that was set in the CARES Act. I'll use Brookhaven Town as an example. They have had maybe about $12 million or so of COVID-19 related expenses, but their population is just under 500,000 people, which means from the CARES Act, they essentially get zero out of that main pot of money. They got some funding through CDBG, but if you were to try to make them whole, let's get them the $12 million if we're passing a bill like this, but let's not get them 4 million, and let's not get them some ridiculous sum of money far exceeding what they're even asking for. And if you just get to the heart of what they're looking for, and I say they, it's not just Suffolk County, it's not just Brookhaven, it's not just municipalities in my congressional district, there's an issue all across the entire country. I think what you'll find is that, for say $75 billion, I'm throwing out a number, for $75 billion, with the right formula, you could probably totally take care of Suffolk County and all of our local municipalities in the 1st Congressional District of New York, making all of them totally whole. So if you could do that with $75 billion in an area that was essentially, just as, hit just as hard as the hardest hit area anywhere in America, why do you need $375 billion for the whole country? And it shouldn't be $375 billion or a bust. It should be a conversation of what do we actually need, and let's get it done. And in this case, I'm giving you an example of, of what could get done. With $75 billion, if you put $50 billion into a county pot and you distribute that money based off of population, if you give them a CDBG entitlement, if it's more beneficial, that'll give the county another approximately $250 million. If you put $25 billion into a pot for the towns and villages, and you put 70% of that pot for CDBG entitlement, 30% for non-CDBG entitlement, $25 billion pot nationally, you just got $12 million to Brookhaven. So let's be smart in how we do it.
So let me just make sure that I get a clear answer, because a lot of questions came out about this, right? So what I think I hear you saying is, yes, state and local governments need help. And if they're bona fide, credible COVID-related expenses, you're in favor of giving them help.
But also not just on the expense side, but also on the revenue side. It's really COVID-19 related impacts, looking at both sides of the ledger so that the money spent is as efficiently as possible. I introduced a bill with Antonio Delgado. He's a House Democrat from the Hudson Valley, a freshman Democrat. And what I just explained to you about a possible funding formula is our funding formula. It's a formula that Schumer and Gillibrand have endorsed over on the Senate side, and other colleagues on the House, the New York congressional delegation on the House side have gotten behind. So we've basically the entire New York congressional delegation. I wrote a letter that the entire New York congressional delegation signed on to, asking for funding for state and local governments. I'm not one of these people. I'm not signing up for how much do you need? Okay, 250 billion. Well, then here's 375 billion. Yeah. I mean, we also have to approach this smartly.
Yep, that's great. So last issue, Lee, I want to talk about testing and where you see sort of the numbers going. There's a lot of talk about increased hotspots. It's increased testing, the numbers, the statistics. What is your take on all of that? Where do you see it? Where do you see it now? Where do you see it heading? And how do you see the fall playing out here in New York?
Well, our numbers here locally are very good. Our numbers were not just bad. Our numbers were actually the worst on the planet a few months ago. It's great how far we've come. As far as where it's going, no one who I speak to is predicting that the numbers are not at any point going to be getting any higher than this. I mean, our numbers now, fortunately, are pretty close to zero. And you hear it from the governor, you hear it from other elected officials, you hear it from others who are providing data, you hear it from people who might be coming from the right, coming from the left, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. New Yorkers all understand that it's not gone. And as far as what the numbers are going to look like in October or December, that answer is just unknown. That's just guesses based off of assumptions. Some are good assumptions. Some will prove to be bad assumptions. You could do it based off of the data and the science that's available to you right now. But still, at the end of the day, no one is speaking with any type of certainty that they know exactly where we're going to be here locally in October or December. And meanwhile, there's a race for a vaccine. The testing has been very much ramped up. The studies on different treatment options have been ramped up. We've seen benefits to early detection and early treatment. If you come down with coronavirus and you wait until you have to get hospitalized, you might find yourself on a vent and then never come off the vent. If you get tested at a point where you might actually still be asymptomatic, but because testing's been ramped up so much, people have been paying attention to their health earlier on in this process, and you're seeing the mortality rate going down. Meanwhile, you're researching these new treatments, you're researching these vaccines, and that's ultimately what we're really on a race against the clock on, is to make it to a point where you can hopefully eradicate it. I mean, that's not any certainty that you can eradicate it, but it's certainly a rush. There is a race going on right now because if it can be eradicated, we want to get it as soon as possible, maybe even before the end of the year if we can.
That's great. You know what? I have one last question. So I know you're friendly with Secretary Mnuchin, right? I think he's done a tremendous job. I got to tell you, when this first happened, there was fear, total fear, just total fear throughout the business community. I think all of you guys have done well, but the Secretary of the Treasury seems to be a very strong person, very consistent, and he seemed to have done a great job doing this. How's he holding up?
He is the most underrated member of the president's cabinet. When you look back on the last several months and the way that our economy has survived it, and listen, we still have work to do. I mean, you started this hour where you're talking about the reporting of numbers. Hopefully it's a good quarter. Not just overall for the economy, but for an individual company to be able to have their best shot of success. What you saw Steve Mnuchin and Jay Powell doing, finding any possible way to inject any extra amount of stimulus and lifeblood and pathway into the economy, has been absolutely amazing. I've been on so many calls with Steve Mnuchin, and by the way, Larry Kudlow has played a good role as the White House economic advisor. There have been a number of people who, when you look back on these last few months, really deserve some type of special medal or praise, or some type of boost to a legacy and history, because you mentioned Mnuchin, and I saw with Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve. Really, a number of people just did an absolutely outstanding job. And the other thing too that I noticed with Mnuchin is, I don't know his history politically. I don't know if he, for all I know, he was once a registered Democrat. I know that there is a backstory. I'm just not even aware of it, so I can't even speak to it. Maybe he's been a lifelong Republican. I have no idea. But I will say that the congressional Democrats work very, very well with him. And Secretary Mnuchin goes into the negotiations not as someone looking to, pander and, be rolled by these other negotiators. I mean, Pelosi and Schumer aren't rolling Mnuchin. There's just a certain amount of mutual respect where I would say, beyond what he's able to do with his department, legislatively, I mean, you had these moments in time where, Steve Mnuchin was doing more to negotiate a massive bill than any member of Congress, any one of the legislative leaders. So kudos to him. I'm happy that he is where he is, that he was where he was throughout this process, and that the public just has no idea just how much he did to help our economy get through this.
Yeah, I recognize that. I've been watching that very carefully. I recognize that. And you know what, Lee? People can say what they want. You delivered. They can say what they want about you. They can disagree with you, but we vote people into Congress to deliver, and you delivered, and the Long Island business community knows that, and we appreciate that. Without certain relationships that you garnered, really grateful. Peter, final comment. They have to be optimistic. Lee, we're going to give you the final comment, but it has to be optimistic.
Yeah, well, listen, everything is, there are many aspects of life is getting better. I mean, we're talking about the lower numbers on coronavirus, and we're seeing higher numbers in certain aspects of the economy. We're talking about people getting back to work. We're talking about people seeing more of their freedoms today than they felt a couple of months ago. And it's summertime. We can treasure the silver linings that we can identify of what we just went through. We could see our local economy, our local community emerging stronger than ever before. And the key is just for us to continue to work through this together, and the potential is limitless.
Yep, it's great. Peter, any thoughts?
Sure. I think that the fact that we took our tough medicine earlier in the spring here in New York has really saved us a lot of pain that other states now are seeing their numbers go higher. So I'm as proud of my local team here, Lee, and your team, everyone who's really made the sacrifices and to get us in a better spot.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. New York shines through this. Such great personalities. We'll leave it at that. But on all levels, we maintained the virus, and people don't realize what we in New York had to deal with. We were the pioneers. No, the world didn't know what was going on. We were the pioneers. You guys all worked hard together, egos aside, and we're the shining example here in the United States of what to do. So, Congressman Lee Zeldin, we thank you so much for your help through this, and everybody, I think, appreciates all the hard work that you are doing. So keep up the good work. And folks, we'll see you next week. We're going to talk to the Stala Center and the Tillis Center and find out what's going on with Broadway and the performing arts, and when we can hope to get some of that. So Lee, thanks again. Have a great week, and we'll talk soon, everybody. Thanks.